Good evening, everybody tuning in. Welcome to the evening sessions of day one of the Culturally Competent Conversations for Equity and Belongingness Summit, or the C3EB Summit. And I am so excited for this presentation coming up because how many of you have heard about Indigenous food systems, how they've been decimated, and the impacts of these of colonization on land, on food systems, on health disparities, and on what it has done to Indigenous populations. I was very intentional about trying to find people who can add perspective, value, and insight to our First Peoples, because all of us as Americans are living on stolen lands. And if we do not include the perspective of the First Peoples who own this land, rightfully so, even though it has been snatched for them because of government, then we are not doing our due diligence as Americans. We are not living up to these so-called ideals that we're supposed to be living up to. So with that in mind, I was very intentional about reaching out to perspectives that have long been minimized from mainstream society. And with that in mind, it is my absolute, what's beyond honor? I can't even just think of the word. It is like, my heart is bursting as I introduce you to Rose Bear Don't Walk, who is, Rose, before I actually officially introduce you, I just want to read your bio so people understand who I am bringing on. Rose Bear Don't Walk seeks to bridge science, culture, and health through her work with traditional Indigenous foods and native plants of Northwest Montana. A longtime resident of the Flathead Indian Reservation, Rose is a descendant of the Bitterroot Salish and Crow tribes of the state. She has a BA in political science, and I don't know if you can see that my goosebumps have goosebumps right now, but she is a BA in political science from Yale University. Recently, Rose received a Master's of Science in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana, having centered her research on the long-standing relationships that Salish people have formed with local edible flora and its implications for community health and cultural longevity. She is also a consultant with Indigenous Pact, PBC, which you're going to have to explain, Rose, which helps tribal entities in health and healthcare. Rose hopes to increase awareness and usage of traditional food plants while also promoting healthy, culturally relevant habits in her Salish community as a 500 Women Scientists Fellow for the Future. She is a powwow dancer, a dog lover, a cook, a runner, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner, and a rotating host of the YouTube series SciShow. Whew! Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for honoring this entire summit with just your presence and your expertise, your contribution, everything. I can't tell you what it means to me personally that when I reached out to you and I said, hey, here's what I want to do, and here's why I think it's important, you immediately said, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yes,
and with
the introduction.
Yeah, with that, I could gush about you forever and ever, but this is your spotlight. So with that, please take it away, blow our minds. I'll be back with question and answers once you're done.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. All right, so I will do a little formal introduction first, and then I'm just going to go into some slides that I have prepared for you all today, more specifically about my work and why I chose to do so. Chesenyak pasia usili tam huisten samke huisquest, chiskel ustem cheat sinyelamin, yepenchenes lemti huil yatwaske u SCR. Hi, everyone. My name is Rose Bear Don't Walk. I am Bitterroot Salish and Crow from Montana. I am 26 years old, and I just said that I was very excited for this day and for everything here and to be a part of this summit. So we're going to start off, and I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, hold on. There it is. Share. Okay, I'm hoping we can all see this. All right, so the main premise of my presentation today is going back to our roots with food, using land and food as tools of creating equity for Indigenous populations. Brief introduction of me. I am a Salish ethnobotanist. And what is ethnobotany, you may say? Ethnobotany is the scientific study of traditional knowledge and customs of people concerning plants and their many uses in society, whether that is for food or for tools, for building, or even for religious purposes. As noted in my intro, I got my BA from Yale University with a focus in political science, and I specialized in environmental studies and environmental policy. I recently reserved my master's degree from the University of Montana in December of 2019, before kind of this all hit the fan. And my master's thesis was called Recovering Our Roots, the Importance of Salish Ethnobotanical Knowledge and Traditional Food Systems to Community Well-Being on the Flathead Indian Reservation. I identify as being a Bitterroot Salish woman and a Crow woman, and the language I spoke in my introduction was the Interior Salish dialect. Currently, I am a consultant with Indigenous Pact, which is a company that helps tribal nations with issues of health and healthcare. We contract with different Indigenous populations and tribes all across the country, and we just kind of see where we can help them out, whether it's running a clinic or doing traditional foods, kind of bringing those back into those communities. It's really up to the tribal groups that we work with and how we can better have health systems and healthcare serve our tribal populations to the best of their ability. I also am a 500 Women Scientist Fellow for the Future. The fellowship was designed to recognize and amplify the crucial role of women of color in science, tech, engineering, and math, or STEM. The goal is to make science more open, inclusive, and accessible while transforming society by fighting racism, patriarchy, and oppressive societal norms. Part of our fellowship was that we got these cute little cartoons made of us, and they're highlighting kind of all the things that we're super interested in. So mine is definitely ethnobotany. It has a lot of really beautiful plants and the things that I study, as well as how I'm bringing it all together. So today we're talking about land, we're talking about equity, we're talking about food systems. How do they all go together? So first I want to kind of situate us. So we're going to talk about land, but in a better sense, territory. This is a map of all the traditional territories of what is now considered North America. Each territory is designated to the areas of the first peoples. That's why there's like tons of overlap. It's very colorful, it's very beautiful, but it just highlights the groups of people that lived there prior to it becoming a nation state and a country. So when we talk about Native Americans in the United States nowadays, the language is difficult to conceptualize for some Indigenous peoples, because we mostly know ourselves by our traditional names, territories, and refer to ourselves based on those languages and those ideologies. So when I tell people I'm Native American, it's a very blanketed statement, mostly because I identify as being Bitterroot Salish. And the Bitterroot Salish, even in itself, is based out of a territory, which I'll show you later in a map. But you can find this map online, and it covers pretty much the entire globe and highlights all of the indigenous populations and indigenous territories in their traditional languages, as well as what they call themselves. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the land that we're on today. Usually I am on the traditional territory of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai. But today I am closer to the traditional territory of the Blackfeet. So those are just some things to think about when we're thinking about land, territory, and place. The reason I wanted to take on this work was because of the amount of chronic diseases that I have seen in my community and across Indian country just generally. And so these ideas about indigenous epidemiology and indigenous research come from this idea that post-colonial disease patterns of indigenous peoples, they start with infectious disease, they're followed by malnutrition, and then further on, obesity, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and depression. And these are kind of known as chronic health diseases. So after the kind of first wave of infectious disease like smallpox, which decimated a lot of indigenous populations, we go to malnutrition as a result of colonization and the kind of impacts it had on the food systems and westward expansion and those things. And then when we move to this assimilation type scenario, we have these chronic diseases of obesity, heart disease, diabetes. And mental health is very, very important for me to attack as well, because I do believe that our chronic health diseases are connected to our mental health, and our mental health is very, very important in today's age. So for indigenous populations, or American Indians more specifically, and I use the terms Native American and American Indian interchangeably just because they're the type of verbiage that's used when we're assessing health. A lot of health data and health surveys seek to approach indigenous populations from the vein of American Indians and Native Americans. So American Indians manifest the highest rates of diabetes compared to other racial minorities in the United States, as well as a high prevalence of obesity. And biomedicine has found direct links between these chronic diseases to nutritional deficiencies. And so when I wanted to attack the health issues that I've seen in my community, I wanted to go in a vein, not particularly in biomedicine, but kind of a more holistic approach by looking at nutrition, by looking at food, by looking at human connections and relationships and connection to culture and tradition. So these are kind of the reasons why I'm taking on the work that I am. So the root of the problem of indigenous epidemiology and why we're at the state that we're at has some very big historical trajectories, or I guess links. So initially we have removal, where westward expansion displaced Native communities. They removed them from their traditional territories, like we saw on the map, and they relocated them to reservations, or they relocated them to an area that was more suitable for them as determined by the federal government. And then they forced them to assimilate to Western ideas and society. And so the federal government policies and their impacts on indigenous food systems kind of started from these three things: removal, relocation, assimilation. But more specifically, there was the acquisition and redistribution of traditional lands. A lot of territories that we have now are bought by non-native people, or not in our acquisition. And they also kind of took our lands and made them a lot smaller than what they were traditionally. And I'll show you that later as well. Also environmental destruction as a result of expansion, creating things like roadways, or even trains or buildings, or any of these sort of new expansion type societies that were different than native societies, those had a direct impact on the environment, not to mention the decimation of a lot of food sources, whether it's fish or game or even plants, by the expansion and more people coming in and utilizing and using up the resources. And then lastly, this assimilation piece comes from the continuous disapproval for primitive cultures, quote unquote, and their ways of life. So, the US government and a lot of colonialists came in and thought indigenous peoples were just dirty and primitive and were living in a way that was just not suitable for man. So they enacted a lot of political, social, and even economic initiatives to kill the Indian and save the man. And so these kind of more broad strokes of what has impacted the food system really started a trajectory of Native American or indigenous peoples shifting their food patterns to these new westernized ideas, and not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they were forced to, and because there were these policies in place to change those food systems in a very negative way. There was also the introduction of the food distribution program on Indian reservations in 1973, which doesn't seem that long ago. I hope I got that date right. But that began a trajectory of the authority over food systems and the introduction of foreign nutrient-poor foods. But a lot of these nutrient-poor foods had been introduced into Native communities kind of prior to this program, and indigenous bodies were not ready for that. We lived according to the land. We had wild fish and wild game and ate plants, and the plants supplemented our diet with vitamins and the nutrition that we needed. But then that transition from traditional food practices and the diet to the American lifestyle, which shifted to wage economy, sedentary nature, and non-traditional foods, ended in the decline of traditional food knowledge and practices and the subsequent health issues. So many aspects of settler colonialism in North America have basically created an environment where American Indian and Alaska Natives fall short in all areas of social determinants of health. And that's looking at health from a point of view of housing, having access to healthcare, having access to food, poverty, inequality, things like that. So it's a very big picture to kind of look at the root of these problems. So we get into this concept called food sovereignty, and it is something that has emerged in the last couple years, and it's become really big so far in Indian country because it's the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, with the right to self-define food and systems. So food sovereignty really attacks this idea that indigenous and tribal nations who have inherent sovereignty already can have autonomy over their food and have food security and have access to healthy, nutritious foods that are culturally relevant and self-defined. And this allows individuals and communities to articulate what food systems are important to them and most applicable in their environment. Food sovereignty looks different across Indian country because the tribes in the Southwest have a completely different diet and a different way of acquiring food, maybe even growing food, than, say, the Salish people in the Pacific Northwest, who depend a lot on the sea and the ocean and the things there. So having the diversity and having the ability of tribal nations to determine what food systems will work for them and empower them the most is kind of the root of food sovereignty and why food sovereignty is becoming so big. A lot of tribal nations are really starting to look at our food systems and say, hey, we have food systems that are not serving our people, and they're actually hurting them more than helping them. So how are we going to change that? And how are we going to get to those traditional roots of having healthy food systems like our ancestors? So the common components of food sovereignty, they usually depend on the dispossession of land, of knowledge, of ways of life. They focus on justice to return equity in food producers. They are sustainable. Indigenous populations lived according to the land, but they also realized that their impact on the land affects how the land is able to provide for them or take care of them. There's a very symbiotic relationship between the people and the place and the environment, and how they can have a symbiotic relationship with each other in order to best serve each other in life. Another component is sovereignty. So people have an inherent right to food, and the US government knows that it has an inherent right to tribal nations to have them have access to food. But it's not the best food. So tribal nations can be sovereign entities and do that for themselves. It also focuses on food as more than a commodity. We're in a global network of food. We can get our food from all over the world, and all the different growing seasons mean that we can have strawberries in the winter. But those strawberries have to travel thousands of miles, be packaged up, and have a larger ecological footprint than strawberries that are grown in their specific season, in the specific climate that can help them grow and are ultimately better for you. So we recognize the complex social, cultural, economic, and political intersections of food and the food processes. And I mean, that could be a talk in itself if we talk about the amount of labor that goes into how our foods get to our table. And ultimately that comes from people of color. Another common component is health of the environment and health of the people through the production of food. Not just, we have the people that are picking the food and producing the food. Their health is very important. And then the health of the people that are consuming the food as well. And then just a general resistance to the corporate food regimes and a capitalistic food economy, because prior to this food system that we live in, traditional food systems were living off the land and trading with other tribes, as opposed to going to a grocery store and buying something in a package flown in from thousands of miles away. Very different ideas, very different ways of living, but we can resist those. So the applications of food sovereignty in Indigenous communities, a lot of them have similar goals as to what I highlighted in the prior slide, but they seek to dismantle the colonial institutions and political frameworks, look at food as a way for tribes to move forward while improving the health longevity of the people, and increase awareness of tribal teachings and traditions, and create sustainable methods of feeding oneself and feeding one's tribe. I think there's a quote I've read where it's, if you can't feed your people, are you really sovereign? Because sovereignty means that you can provide, you have the ability to govern your peoples, your lands, and make those decisions to be autonomous. But if we can't feed our people, and we have our people in incredible health disparities, how are we going to move forward as a tribe, as a nation? So these kind of 4 pieces of Native American food sovereignty is health, economic development, because that's autonomy, culture, because culture is really the thing that ties everything together, whether it's food, whether it's language, whether it's traditions, whether it's family or health. Culture is kind of just the glue that holds that together, because there's so much teachings and so many traditions that really showcase how important food is to our communities. And then there's nationhoods. We can create policies and programs aimed at native food systems and having control of the food systems, but we just have to have the capacity to do so. So this is what food sovereignty looks like for Indigenous populations. It's just kind of a broad ideology. And there's specific cases of different Indigenous populations doing food sovereignty and enacting food sovereignty, whether that's having a agricultural enterprise, whether that's providing food for their communities through tribal CSAs, or even just having policies that restrict what can come into the reservation in terms of food. Those are just some of the few ways that food sovereignty can be enacted in tribal nations. So kind of to get more place-based, this is where I come from. This is on the left, the Bitterroot Valley, where the Salish people originated from. It's kind of southwest of Montana. If you look at the other map, it's kind of in that common hunting ground area, as well as the Little Blue area. So a lot of that was utilized by the Salish. And then we have the Salish place names, and this is where culture comes into play, where we understand how food, culture, and place come together, because a lot of our Salish place names tell us about the environment, whether it's something as simple as the wind blows there, or there's a lot of fish there. This is where camas grows. This is where we meet people. Different things like that. That's all involved in how place names were created and how the people knew the landscape. And ultimately is a very, I think, more easy way of understanding the landscape than the place names on these places as imposed by colonization and people coming in and renaming it. So also in the left or the right map, you can see the Flathead Indian Reservation is that tiny little spot in the middle of that blue area. And the blue area was the traditional roaming ground. So that's where Salish people would go to hunt, where they would go to fish, where they would go to forage. They would go all over that area. And then you take them and you concentrate them to that single place that's designated for them to live. It becomes a lot harder to hold on to those traditional values and those traditional food systems. And the word for Salish people, what we call ourselves, is scaly, which means that we are the flesh of the land and the meat of the earth. We come from the land. We are intimately intertwined with it. And that's why it's so important to have land-based practices, not just for food, but for our own being as well. So getting into this next piece, which is how I kind of got more into the world of ethnobotany, is looking at food as medicine. We can use food to combat these chronic illnesses that are really prevalent in our communities right now, as well as combine food as medicine with the healing of our people, of ourselves, of our mental health, of our emotional health, because of these impacts of colonization. And that's through the connection of traditional food systems. So current day, even small amounts of traditional food consumption improves diet quality and has a lot of social and cultural benefits. When we go out and interact with the land and interact with our culture and our traditions, there's something that changes inside of us, with our whole being, with our spirit. And I feel that deeply when I go out and interact with the land and eat traditional foods. So, if we have a decrease in the transmission of knowledge about traditional foods and traditional food systems, that negatively affects how it's consumed. And one of the reasons I took on this project of studying Salish plants, food plants, was because a lot of the people in my community, they still hunt, they still fish, they partake in those types of traditional ways of getting food, but some of the knowledge about Salish plants that were eaten as food has kind of been lost. And we have elders that have that knowledge and know that, but we have to keep it going, and we have to keep teaching young people about our traditional foods in the forms of plants, because the Salish utilize hundreds upon hundreds of foods that I probably still haven't even learned about yet, in traditional food systems. And so there's so much to learn there, and there's so much connection that we can have with the land as a result of that. And so without the ability of a community to renew their relationship with the land through these practices and through connection with land and animal and plant and water and all of the things that go into that, languages, indigenous languages, traditional teachings, livelihoods are jeopardized. Everything comes back to having this relationship with the land, because that is so core to our being. And to the right is a picture I took. It's camas bulbs, and camas is a staple food of the Salish. It's a beautiful plant, and camas bulbs provide a huge amount of carbohydrates to the community. Okay, so why ethnobotany? When I wanted to look at food as medicine, I wanted to look specifically at food plants, because I know that there are people still practicing hunting and fishing, and these are things that I definitely want to learn as I get older. But I took a class in my master's degree called Plants and Culture, and there was something that just stuck out so much to me about the ways that plants are imbued in our everyday life, whether it's the clothes that we have, the tools, what makes our houses, what we eat, what we use as for hygiene. I mean, they're everywhere. Some sort of base of a plant is used in pretty much everything that we have right now. And so plants were really big for indigenous communities. And food plants in particular were just super interesting to me because they're still around. Our creation stories tell us that plants are a gift. Plants were given to us as gifts in times of famine, or from the animals, and the animals taught us everything we know about the world. And in our creation stories, humans are a very small part of the world. We were the last to arrive on this earth. There were the plants and there were the animals first, and those two beings teach us how to live our lives in a good way. And I wanted to understand plants more in depth. So that's why I chose to study plants and people, and specifically the Salish people and their relationship to plants, and what that means for us as a culture, as a tribe, and as people that are trying to renew their relationship with the land. So the left photo is a wild raspberry. The middle photo is a nodding onion, and they have these beautiful nodding flowers. And then the photo on the right is camas, and that is the flower to the bulb that we saw in the earlier slide. Okay, so my master's thesis, I really wanted to cement the idea that Salish well-being is beyond what biomedicine thinks health is. If you are healthy, you're in the absence of anything that would ail your body. That's what being healthy is. But I think for Salish people and for a lot of Indigenous cultures, our well-being is intimately tied to our culture. And I wanted to show that our culture is tied to plant knowledge, and plant knowledge is just kind of a small subset to the culture as a whole, but really has a lot to do with our culture as Salish people. So we have Salish well-being, and then we have the culture and traditional plant knowledge that informs that. And ultimately, when we engage with those things, we become healthier as people, and we become well. And that means that we are connecting with ourselves, with our culture, with our language, with the land. And in doing so, there are aspects of our physical body that are enacted on, going out and foraging or hunting or anything like that. You're moving around on the land. And then the mental and spiritual aspect of it, of engaging in these traditional ways that had been passed down for generations. So that's the kind of point I wanted to hammer home in my research and my studies. And so when I was doing my research, I really wanted to build a way that we can start reconnecting with traditional food plants. And that took me learning about the plants themselves, botanically and scientifically, but it also meant understanding the relationships that Salish people have with plants, how they got knowledge about these plants, what they call these plants, how they know these plants, what information and memories are associated with these plants. And what I found, because I did a lot of interviews with Salish community members, is a lot of our knowledge is tied to oral history and hands-on experience. And so the hands-on experience component of it is really impactful for your physical being. And by learning that knowledge from, say, your grandma or from an elder or from your family, that enacts this kind of cultural bond that's really important in Indigenous societies. So my goal with my master's thesis and my research was to have a resource available to Salish people that showed ethnobotany and showed the history of their food plants from someone that comes from that community. A lot of the science world and a lot of ethnography, anthropology, ethnobotany consists of white academics coming into traditional communities, asking for information, and then just kind of leaving and having no stake in that community. But because I live in the place and I see the impacts of chronic health diseases, I have stake in my community, and I have stake in what happens there and how we can become better, healthier people. So my resource of my thesis was to highlight all of our traditional food plants, how they're processed, how they're known, what are the cultural stories or ways of knowing them or the language involved with them. And my hope is by Salish people interacting with that resource, they can have an increase in Salish people having knowledge and access and engagement with Salish food plants. Excuse me. So by having more engagement with traditional food plants, we are having a way of continuing this knowledge and continuing this relationship that has been established since time immemorial. Another goal is to contribute to the traditional food plant knowledge of the Salish community through facilitation, collaboration, and creation of educational materials for future use. One of those being my thesis. And then the second, I've been doing biweekly newsletters highlighting different Salish plants and their uses and how to identify them, and send it out to the community. I was going to do in-person workshops as a part of my fellowship, but because we have COVID, and we want to protect the community, I am sending out educational materials instead. And my hope is to someday build a Salish food plant curriculum that combines the science of botany, of identifying plants, of knowing how they work and where they grow and how the environment affects them, in addition to the important ways that Salish people know them and process them and use them. And so another piece of this is when we learn about the land and we learn about plants and we learn about the beings that live on the land and realize it's important for us to have a relationship with them, it creates value. There's a lot of people that kind of just go out hiking or go out in the landscape and they walk by so many plants that can be used for so many different things. And this idea of plant blindness is something I wanted to combat in my own community and also in Montana in general. If we realize that the native plants have uses and are important, we can start creating protection and appreciation for them. And this photo is, it's a spring beauty, which is one of my favorite food plants. Its other name is Indian potato. It's a beautiful little plant and it produces just a tiny, tiny little potato. And it's very delicious. So the benefits of food sovereignty just kind of encompass a lot of ways that we're trying to fix the food system just generally. Food is the center of culture. It's the center of who we are. Our lives basically revolved around the seasons and how we would access food and follow food and learn about the land. Traditional foods are whole foods. They're probably the healthiest foods on the planet. I think that's the reason why chronic illness hit us so hard, was because prior to colonization, we were probably the healthiest civilizations in North America, because we ate with the seasons, we ate whole foods, we moved a lot, we had connections with other people, relationships, things like that. Traditional food is hyper-local, it's organic, and I mean, you know, there's the idea that organic is better for health, but I think for the most part, it's just that you're getting something from the earth that hasn't been touched by other chemicals or other things like that. They promote generosity as well as a symbiotic relationship. There's usually a lot of reciprocity when it comes to harvesting plants and engaging with plants. We always offer a prayer or an offering to the plants when we go harvest, and just thank it for giving its life to us, because by giving its life to us, we're continuing our own lives in health and prosperity. And it follows the food web, something that is hyper-local, comes with the seasons, is very localized to that environment. These are all the ways that food sovereignty with traditional foods is so impactful, not just for our bodies, but for our environment and for our communities. Okay, I hope I haven't loaded you with a bunch of information, but I do love to talk about plants and why they are so important to our society. But we also want to recognize land, and we want to recognize that land is the basis of plants and it's the basis of life, and not in a sense that we own land. That's definitely a colonial way of looking at the earth as something that you can own, something you can trade and buy and all of these things. And that's just not how land was seen in Indigenous perspective. But in the current moment, if you want to know what traditional territory you're on, there's a handy little text app that you can use, also developed by that same native land map. You just text the number, tell them your zip code, your city, your state, where you're at, and they'll tell you what traditional lands you're on. which is kind of cool because you can go anywhere and use it. If you're international, I would check out the traditional territory map because it does highlight different countries around the world and what their indigenous populations look like. Another way that you can increase food and land equity is to make a conscious effort to do what you can to protect the environment. All regions and all environments are important ecologically not just humans, because we're not, the coolest thing that's out there. I mean, there's tons of animal beings that live in these environments, and they also have to live. So protecting the environment, whether that's through policies, whether that's through individual behaviors, doing what you can for this earth, because if we don't take care of it, it can't take care of us. If you want to help Indigenous peoples, support Indigenous food companies, restaurants, groups, food research, or Indigenous research generally, as well as communities. There's a lot of Indigenous food enterprises coming up right now. We have books, we have theses, we have a bunch of really good things going in our communities. And to support them means that you're supporting local people as opposed to corporations. Kind of the biggest thing with food and land equity is this idea of a land back, because a lot of the land that was allocated in U.S. federal policies with the reservation era, with checkerboarding, with things like that, that's not in our, we don't own that anymore. We don't have access to that anymore. So by land back, we want the lands that we used to use to be in our possession again, because they were so wrongfully taken from us, or we were removed from it and kept from it by policies and colonial institutions. So increasing Indigenous land access and knowledge and advocating for land return is super important. Creating opportunities for tribes to do what they'd like with their land and their resources, which is just another way of saying economic opportunity, to build businesses, to be autonomous, to maybe have farms, or all these different things that Indigenous tribes can do. We need advocacy for that. And then lastly, participate in the local food economies of wherever you are. This can be done by buying local foods. If you have the capacity to forage, go forage, support local food businesses, go to the farmer's market, learn about the food culture of wherever you're situated. And if you want to, learn about the edible flora and fauna of the area. I kind of always like to travel different places and see what grows there and what you can eat, just because I'm a nerd and I really love that stuff. Grow your own garden. Seeds are very cheap, and plants just need a little bit of love, some sunlight, some water, and some really important nutrients in the soil. Or start a community garden. These are all ways that we can get involved in our food systems and take it back to be individually autonomous by growing our own food or knowing where our food comes from, but also supporting local food economies that are not resting on the labor of other people of color. Our dollars matter. Where we put our money matters. Where we are getting our food matters. So next time you're just thinking about cooking or thinking about getting something, think about where your food comes from. And also think about what land you're on. And I think that once we start looking at those through a different lens, we can start creating more equity for Indigenous populations, but also for ourselves. And this is just a little quote about traditional plants from my research and my thesis. The traditional plants of our area hold a sacred connection to everything that we are. Yes, it's good to enjoy them, but when you take the understanding further with stories, plants as medicine, the health properties, it feeds all of who you are. And that's really what I want to see happen in my community, is feeding all that we are through traditional plants. And those are my references. They're really small to see, but thank you for attending my workshop. And I am so happy I got to share this with you. Please let me know if you have questions, or, throw anything at me.
Rose, that was so beautiful. So, yeah, we have several. I don't know if you can see the comments. PRXWRX, which, okay, I can't believe he did this. So in full disclosure, that's my husband, and he's in my basement. But he just looked this up. So we live on the land of, how do you say that?
Peoria, Anishinaabe, oh, my Anishinaabe is really bad.
That our Jordan is Anishinaabe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask her tomorrow. But this has been so, so amazing. So your list of resources and that list of books that Daryl Montana is asking for, we can definitely put it on our website. We can list it as resources on C3EB, on EJ Rao, on our platforms and everything, because I think everything you talked about today is so important, especially for those of us, it's funny. I want to tie all of this together for all of us. When you and I had this conversation and I said, hey, Indian to Indian, what do you think?
Yes.
Indian to Indian, we agreed that this is not even a political statement. Columbus was a fool. But, just what First Peoples can teach us, not, of course, in terms of the stolen lands, of course, in terms of the food, the ethnobotany of the lifestyles, but also the adaptations, the resilience, spirit of keeping to the land, of tending to your soul. And then all of the inequities and disproportionate disparities that come with that, including your erasure from mainstream conversations that shouldn't be happening without you.
For sure.
Absolutely. So given all of that, let me ask you a question before we close out. For those of us who are not First Peoples, who are not Native American, who are not from Indigenous tribes, especially those of us, and this is very personal for me, especially those of us that share that Indian name with you in a very different way. What do you need us to do to uplift your voices? What is equitable for, and I understand you can't speak for all of Native Americans everywhere. That being said, how can we support this amazing culture that has been, cultures that have been decimated through genocide and neglect and marginalization and just all of the awful things that came from colonization?
And that's a great question. Because sometimes I have to think about how other people can support this movement for ourselves, even if they don't have this intimate knowledge or connection with the land or with the foods or anything like that. But really, it comes back to how can we adequately respect the land and respect the cultures that use the land. For example, we have national parks, we have reserved wilderness areas and things like that. Those areas that were traditionally used by Indigenous peoples, they don't have access to that anymore. So even if that's within policies to have access to traditional territories in national parks or state parks or anything like that, I think that could be a way better way to protect the environment but also create equity for those cultures that used to use it. But there are other small things by just supporting Indigenous movements, supporting Indigenous food sovereignty, taking initiative and knowing where your food comes from, just things like that, really not just increases equity for Native people, but increases equity for all the people that are involved in food production.
Absolutely. And that, in a very soulful way, really, really kind of touches the inner core of like my cultural heritage and everything, because to this day, in fact, I believe my dad and my mother-in-law are actually watching this because they are huge plant people. They grow their own vegetables and all of this amazing stuff. And I know my husband's watching this. So this session has become like a family affair. And I'm being bombarded with texts to ask my husband's questions. So I'm going to do that. Because he's in the basement and I have to see him right after. In the food manufacturing / chain, are the current plants similar to what were grown centuries ago?
You might have to unpack that a little bit. What exactly does that mean?
I mean, I've been married to him for 8 years and I don't understand him, so. No, I'm kidding.
Maybe a common one that just comes up off the top of my head. So we have huckleberries in Northwest Montana. Okay. And if you've ever had a chance to have a huckleberry, it's incredibly delicious. And it grows in a pretty localized environment here. But huckleberries become a huge commodity in our food system. So there's like huckleberry candies, there's huckleberry shakes, there's huckleberry ice cream, there's all sorts of huckleberry things. And that's been changed into a more food manufacturing type thing, as opposed to when it was just picked and eaten traditionally.
Yeah, apparently that was part of apparently there's a 200 character limit. I did not know this. So this is a question. This is why I was like, I don't understand what he's talking about. So the full thing says, thank you for sharing and educating us on Salish food. Wondering, with the changes in growing practices, cross-pollination, genetic engineering, and all of those, when it comes to food manufacturing and the food chain, are the current plant systems similar to what the ancestral systems were?
I see. Okay.
See, that makes a whole lot more sense now.
I understand now. So there's some differences in our community about having access to plant knowledge in a way that is like, okay, here's how to identify it, here's how to use it, and making that more public, because people are worried that it's going to become a part of the food manufacturing and commodity type chain. But I think the coolest thing about our food plant is that they have a huge inability to be commodified. Aside from like the huckleberry, which grows in kind of bigger amounts and it has become commodified, a lot of the foods that we utilized grow in such a specific environment. Like we couldn't throw them in a greenhouse or throw them in a genetic engineering lab to be changed, because they can't adapt to that environment in order to be used in that way. So a lot of the foods that we have access to are still the same, and haven't really changed in those ways throughout time.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So now I can get back to my line of questioning. Thanks, P. I had to again. He's also one of the backers of this project, so I get to sort of play with him. But getting back to colonization and all of that as we wrap this up, what can we do? What can we do to Because again, like you and I were talking about before the session and all of that, there really is this pervasive undercurrent of a thought that Indian American communities, Native American communities, however you want to classify them, Indigenous, Indian, Native, whatever, they're very closed off. They're very tight knit. You can't get, outsiders can't get their foot in the door, and they don't, there's this real disconnect just based on what is portrayed in mainstream everything, media, lifestyle, all of that. So how can we, everything you're talking about today and everything Jordan's going to be talking about tomorrow, these are really important things which go back to the origins of this land that we're living on. What can we do to uphold the values of the land and the values of the original people, the original owners? Like, what can we do?
I think that really stems from educating ourselves about Indigenous peoples, whether it's land acknowledgement or knowing what territory you're on, or seeking to abolish the stereotypes of Native people portrayed in mainstream media, because none of those are accurate about the 574 tribes that are in the United States. But also just, it comes down to having a seat at the table and having the voices put into decision making or policy making, or having more Native people in different professions so we can expose ourselves to, hey, not all Natives look the same. We're all just very diverse, kind of just like our ecosystems. It's a very diverse group and groups of people. So I think that allowing Native peoples to share their voice, like on this platform, which I think is great, thank you so much, but making that more widespread. We need more Indigenous people and Indigenous voices in all sorts of different professions around, so we can combat these stereotypes and these ideas associated with our cultures as a product of colonization.
Absolutely. Which is why, even though this may be very, very premature, because I haven't planned out any of this beyond the couple of conversations I've had with you and Jordan, this is what motivated me to think about that Indian to Indian, Heart to Heart series, learning from First Peoples to immigrants who share the same name because of a drunken fool. But did I say that out loud? but really learning the history and really learning the cultural values, and really learning that none of us, including you, and when I asked that question for you, I didn't mean to put you on the spot or treat any of this as some kind of a monolithic culture. I think you and I understood that, but I want to make that very clear, that I was asking for your individual opinion as an individual Indian American. But
absolutely,
bringing those representations out, bringing more and more and more of these voices out, I'm committed to it. I'll do everything on my part to make that happen. So anybody that any of y'all know, you're hearing this now on a very public forum, and it's being recorded and it's going to be out there, and all of you are witnesses. Anybody that want to have these conversations and learn and have Indigenous peoples, First Peoples, Native Americans, Indian Americans, no matter what their quote unquote labels are, depending on where they are in the country, to share their voices, to share their perspectives. I'll do everything in my power to uplift that, because I think that's a bare minimum I can do.
Yes, and incredibly important to society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much. So I have a black thumb. everything you told me sounds so great, but I've killed so many plants at this point that I'm not even allowed to look at my father's garden
Oh my
or
gosh.
breathe on it because he's like, no, you walk away. So you and I will have a lot more sustained conversations offline on how I convert that black thumb into, hey, plant, I don't want you to die. I just want to look at you and admire you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm happy to help with that.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for your amazing contribution. I mean, oh my God, I was like listening to your presentation and I didn't even know there was so much to it. So thank you. Seriously, from the bottom of my heart. And of course, you're going to be coming back on the podcast, on these Indian to Indian Heart to Hearts and future series. So for everyone listening, thank you for joining in live or later. We will get all of these resources out to you because we want this conversation. I want this conversation to sustain. I want all of us as Americans to participate and support and uplift Indigenous voices. And that's just humanity. So let's do it.
Yes.
Thank you, Rose.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.